This interview is part of the Government Design Finland network Thursday gatherings. From time to time, I host these sessions and I record the main conversation. After the initial exchange, participants have the opportunity to speak directly with the guest, creating a shared space of dialogue. When I asked members of the network whom they would like to invite to these conversations, I received only a few suggestions. Most of them were the usual names, the well-known design gurus who appeared at every possible event. Moments like these remind me how narrow the radar in our field can sometimes be. Many colleagues seem to know only the established figures, often designers who are already mid-career or senior, all males. This is why I see a lot of value in bringing forward new voices, especially younger female voices. Expanding who gets to speak ultimately expands what design can be. In that spirit, this episode features Sarah Elsie Baker, a designer and researcher at the Media Design School in Auckland, New Zealand. She's the author of Designing Gender, the Feminist Toolkit. In our conversation, Sarah reflects on why such a toolkit is necessary today and how it can be used to develop a more critical, equitative, and reflective design practices. My name is Mariana Salgado. This is Diseño y Diáspora.
Everybody, thanks for inviting me, Mariana. It's really great to be here. My name's Sarah Elsie Baker, and I'm an associate professor and the head of research at a design school in Auckland in Aotearoa, New Zealand, called Media Design School. I mainly teach on the postgraduate design program now, and mainly within the area of user research and user experience design. I also kind of supervise a lot of master's projects and PhD projects these days, which is really nice.
And what did you study?
So for my degree, for my undergraduate degree, I studied marketing and advertising, and then I went to work in design agencies. But in my time in some of those agencies, I wanted to think about things in a bit more depth than I was allowed to. So then I went back to university, and my master's and my PhD are in cultural studies. And then I went back to teaching design. So I've kind of had a bit of a mix of education in cultural studies and media studies and in design, which I think actually really has informed the toolkit that I'm going to talk about and the book that I'm going to talk about, actually.
Yes, we are here because we want to know about your Feminist Toolkit, and which is a book. So why does design actually need a Feminist Toolkit?
Well, I think, and obviously you all work in kind of government agencies, but I think, design has a very strong history that's grown up, design with a capital D, I should say, and I kind of want to make that distinction, has a history that's really kind of intertwined with industrial capitalism. And I think design itself has played a part in reproducing gender inequalities as part of heteropatriarchy, I would call it. Not only, design itself as an industry has issues around visibility and representation in terms of gender, still, especially in the kind of level of the boardroom, that's still an issue. But also, and this is something that I start talking about in the book, and what I'm really interested in is how design objects often reproduce gender norms. And I think we kind of, to a certain extent, kind of do that unknowingly. There's a sense in which they, that's just how it is. And we think that users understand those norms and that, it's easy to understand if we do it this way. And so they kind of often get reproduced. And that's something that I really wanted to kind of explore and get designers in particular and design students to think about.
And can you give me an example in which we reproduce these gender imbalances?
Yeah, I think there's lots of different examples. I mean, the most obvious one and the one that gets talked about so much is particularly in packaging. And I'm not quite sure of the Finnish context, but at least in the UK context where I'm from originally, I should say, and the New Zealand context, in terms of packaging, gender discourse and gender norms still get reproduced all the time. Um, Especially in things like beauty products or hair gel or shampoo and all those things. If you think about the conventions of packaging design, they are very gendered. So even down to things like selection of materials. So um, for men's shower gel packaging, there'll often be a higher grade plastic that's utilized for that packaging, in order to make it look more sturdy and more kind of masculine in a sense. And when I say masculine or feminine, I'm kind of saying it in inverted commas to a certain extent. Um, and even if you think about font choice, typefaces, um, if we think about those kind of ways that design reproduces gender norms, there are lots of places where that happens, but also with new and emerging technologies as well. So, um, this is quite a talked about example, but when Siri was first launched onto the market, if as the user you said to Siri, "You're a slut," the response from Siri would be, "I'd blush if I could." So that is really reproducing these kind of awful ideas around gender. Um, and that's changed now, right? Doesn't do it anymore because obviously people complained. It was a big deal and it was adapted over time. But but there's quite a lot of other examples of when technologies kind of first go on the market that actually they haven't been tested with a varied range of users, and also perhaps people who might have a more critical eye of what those technologies kind of
So
suggest.
now I would like to go to the meat of this conversation. So, what
Mm,
exactly is inside the feminist designer's toolkit?
well, and I should say that it's a bit more of dialogic toolkit than a prescriptive one.
Okay.
So I kind of see the toolkit as the book, and I tried to write the book with a young designer or a design student in mind. So I tried to make it, well, where there is theory and there's theory there, I tried to make it relatively easy to understand. So there are theories, there are concepts, there are one of the tools that I really like in the book is there are in each kind of in each section there are questions for designers, and for me, a question is one of the best tools. I believe.
Can you tell me
In
some of these questions? What are these key
ooh,
questions that we should be asking
shall I
ourselves?
try and
Yes.
find I'll
Yes.
try and find some good ones. Let's there's so this comes from the part because I was talking about user research, I'll do some of these. So it says, when starting to work on a brief or completing user research, consider the following. Is gender an explicit or implicit element in the design you're creating? Are you making any gendered assumptions about your users? Have you done primary research? Have you included a range of perspectives or invited users to co-design your artifact? When conducting your research, have you allowed space for people to express themselves rather than fit into predetermined categories? Have you tested your prototypes or iterations widely to make sure they don't reproduce normative assumptions or unequal power relations? And that's really, in relation to the Siri example, I feel as though, well, if they'd gone through those questions,
Yeah.
maybe we would have had a better. And I'm not saying that these questions are particularly groundbreaking, especially these kind of user ones, but I do think they're helpful as a prompt to get people thinking about, okay, have we done these things? And actually, I think at least in commercial design contexts, when time is often of the essence, some of these things do get forgotten, I think.
And do you want to tell us something about the process of the book? Because I guess the book,
Yeah.
no, I mean, you have not done any book is done alone, right? Normally,
Yeah.
it's a group of people around it. So how was it?
Yeah. It was this book was a very long time in the making. So I've been teaching design for a long time now, and often teaching students about gender or social inequality and design. And what I noticed was that there were lots and lots of resources from feminist and queer theory that I found very useful for thinking through some of these issues. But actually, there were really not much material that applied it to the context of design. What existed, which was very useful, was kind of written in the late 80s. So there was a kind of emergent bit of research that happened then. So for a while, I was just gathering resources and talking to people about gender and design, kind of waiting for someone else to write the book that I wanted. But
Mhm.
I'd waited quite a long time, and after a while, I was thinking, okay, I think I might need to do this myself because no one else is going to do it.
Yeah.
And that was really the process. I think also kind of moving from a UK context to a Aotearoa New Zealand context meant that I think I realized how contextual the experience of gender is. And also, I think, or at least this is what some people have said of the material in the book, is that there's quite a strong influence of Indigenous cosmologies in the book, partly because of that move. And I've lived in Aotearoa for about 13 or 14 years now. I guess that was also part of the process.
And how these indigenous cosmologies relate to this gender issue?
Oh, see, for me, the approach that I take in the book is one which is a kind of queer feminist approach, which argues for design beyond binary. So beyond the binary of masculine, feminine, men, woman, nature, culture, all those things. And for me, learning even just a little bit about Māori culture and Māori approaches to the world really helped me to think about, okay, well, how might we think differently about not in a beyond binaries essentially, because those binaries come from a very Western philosophical frame. And so the last chapter in the book is really thinking about that and how we can draw on things like queer theory, but also Indigenous thought in order to think more sustainably and around the kind of interconnectedness of humans and non-human.
And this is also part of the toolkit. Is it also part of your questioning?
Yes, I suppose it's the end of the book as well. So I'm keen to get people to think more wildly or rebelliously, I suppose. So in one of the tools, I ask whoever is using it, so the reader or the workshop participant or whoever it is, to map some of the entanglements. So one of the questions is choose a material object that contributes to your experience of gender. What is it? How is it made? Who and what are involved in this process of making, and how are they connected? So I'm really trying to get people to think about technologies themselves and the all the non-human and human actors involved in that creation of that object. And one of the reasons for doing that, I think, is to bring a more conscious kind of thought to that process of designing and using materials in itself.
Interesting. Which attitude or bias or blind spots have you seen that people overcome when they start
Yeah,
using this type of toolkit?
I would say there's kind of four tools that I've have used the most with people and also that I've seen people use. So the first chapter is really just always really exploring the meaning of gender and the definition of gender and what gendered experience and gendered things are. And so there's two tools in that first chapter. One is really a gender journal where it asks people to reflect on their experience of gender. There's two questions that I have found really revealing, actually. One is where people feel the most weight from their gender and where people feel the most free from their gender. And has been really interesting for me in terms of there are often kind of key contexts or key moments in people's lives where they really feel that weight. So, for instance, motherhood is something, or fatherhood often comes up as the place where people really feel the weight of their gender identity. Actually, when I was writing the book, my daughter was 3 and my son had just been born, so it was very kind of timely in that sense that I was really feeling that weight of my gender while writing the book. But I think just that reflection and getting people to think about, okay, when do I feel this and when don't I, is really helpful in terms of reflective practice. The other tool in that chapter is around gender norms, and they're just cards that I get people to discuss. So things like they have statements on them around gender norms. So one around, say, Helvetica is a more masculine font, and then I get people to talk about the norm or think about that norm. So I think those tools have been are a good introduction in terms of reflection, and I think especially students, once design students start to see those norms in the world, then they start to see them everywhere. It's like once you once once it's revealed, all of a sudden you can't unsee it.
Yeah.
And then, of course, you've got to think about what you can do about it, which is the next challenge.
Yeah. And are you aware of any public sector team or organizations that have used it, like in the public sector? Because as we are all designers in public sector.
Yeah, specifically, I'm aware of one team who were working on a project with an NGO that was focused on family violence in particular. And they used there's a tool in the book called it's around situated knowledge. So the tool it's called a situated knowledge map, essentially. And before the team started working on that brief, every person in the team explored and reflected on their own position, so their own background, their ancestors, their education, all the kind of different background, really to think about their positionality and their situated knowledge. So what knowledge they brought to the project. And really that tool is trying to help people to understand the insights that they might be able to offer in the project, but also the blind spots they might have. And also to make tacit knowledge, so knowledge that you are not really aware that you have, to make that more explicit among the team. And so that group used that tool as a way of kind of also learning about each other, which is really good as a team, but also thinking about, okay, who do we have in our group? Do we need to bring other people in to bring a different perspective? Say, for instance, if you have a big blind spot in terms of the subject area. So that situated knowledge map, I think, is particularly useful in that context.
Perfect. And I wanted to ask you because there is a recurring critique in the design community that toolkits can sometimes be applied kind of superficially, right?
Yeah.
Without real contextual understanding. Designers, we kind of love too much toolkits. So how do you respond to that? And how do you encourage like a deeper and more thoughtful use of your toolkit?
Yeah, I agree with the critique
Yeah,
completely.
me too.
Um, and I think the idea that I suppose probably if you came to the book and the tools and you wanted a toolkit, you might be a bit annoyed because it's not really what you think of as a toolkit because you can't just apply it to different contexts because really what the tools are doing is are prompting you to consider your context and to think about the ways in which gender manifests itself differently in different contexts. So I was really, really happy that there had been some people who read the book from cultures that I'm not so familiar with. So even though some of the case study, I tried to be quite diverse with the interviews and the case studies that I used globally and different contexts where gender kind of manifests itself really differently. But I was really happy with some of the reviews that essentially suggested that it was really useful in a very different context, like not in Aotearoa, not in a non-Western context. So that was really nice to hear from me because that was part of my intention that it couldn't just talk about gender from a Western perspective.
So, how did you pick the cases in order to have this
Ah,
broad, yeah,
yeah.
that you are talking now?
I have to say the cases and the interviews were, I would say, not very scientifically selected. More a case of me thinking, I was talking about I gathered all those materials as I was writing the book or about thinking about writing the book. And most of them came from the resources that I'd gathered. And that also, I suppose I had done a bit of testing because when you use them in the classroom, you kind of get a feeling of, oh, this example is really good at demonstrating this area. And the interviews, a mix of some people that I knew already, but also some other people that I was put in contact with because they had heard about my book and the interest that I had in gender from a kind of queer feminist perspective.
So, if we are designers that are interested in this gender with a queer feminist perspective, what would you recommend us?
Well,
How do we
first of
kind
all,
of
I think,
develop this
have you,
sensibility, right? Because
yeah,
it's a question of being informed, but also be reminded. What else?
yeah, I think it's a case of, first of all, I think thinking of, I would always start with your own experience, like thinking about your own experience and learning from the environment around you. Because also, I really believe there are lots of small things that designers can do that can really make a difference. So, one of the examples that I quite often talk about is, so you're working with a client, you produce some design work for them, and this happens more in graphic design. They come back to you, they say, "Oh, yeah, it's looking quite good, but we want to make it more masculine." Then, as a designer, what you can do is say, "Oh, would you give me 3 or 4 words to describe what you mean?"
Yeah.
And then they come back, and then you're not only you're getting them to think about what they mean by masculine, but also you're getting a more specific brief in terms of what actually they want. And I think that just those small things can actually make quite a big difference in terms of questioning those norms and assumptions around gender.
This episode is part of the list Nueva Zelanda, di Diseño, Diseño feminista, Diseño con perspectiva de género, investigación en diseño, and D&D in English. Even though the list's names are in Spanish, you might find episodes in English and Portuguese. In D&D in English, all the episodes are in English. I'm still figuring out what it really means to make a trilingual podcast. Some days it feels like a beautiful challenge, and some days it feels, well, just challenging. It's not always easy to decide how to classify episodes when the conversations go beyond countries, languages, beyond design fields, age groups, and approaches. It's a big, messy, or a wonderful constellation. Right now, We have almost 80 episodes on feminist design, which could easily be a podcast on its own. So if you're curious about how designers address gender issues, or if you want to explore research around those topics, I really encourage you to visit that list. There are some true pearls in there. When I started looking for designers working with feminist perspectives, I never imagined I could interview so many or encountered such rich, diverse work. It honestly surprised me, and most of these voices come from the global south. There is so much to learn from them, and I'm grateful to be able to share perspective from Asia, Europe, North and South America, and Oceania. So let's continue listening to Sarah. She has much more to share with us. Good. And have you used the toolkit yourself in real project as a designer?
Yes, I have. Mostly, I've used it with students, but also I've used it on a couple of design projects where the client was more kind of NGO related, so more gender related clients. And mostly we used the situated knowledge map. There's another tool which is called the listening positionality exercise, which is really helpful at building teams. So you come together with your colleague, you give them a minute to rant about something that annoys them, and then after they've done that, you write down what their values are, what they believe in, how they feel, and then after that, and then you speak to your colleague and say, "Oh, this is what I'm thinking that you feel," and then after that, you kind of reflect, the tool asks you to reflect on whether that style of listening was different from how you normally listen, and it also asks you to reflect on whether you think your positionality, your identity affects the way you listen. And that toolkit really or that part of the toolkit really comes from a critique of design, especially design or user research and design research, as kind of involved in hungry listening. So you're only really listening for the things that you want to hear, and everything else is like dismissed. And so with that tool, I think what's interesting is getting people to think about, okay, how am I listening? Like, am I giving people space and time to talk about everything that is an issue? Or am I just trying to find small things that I think relate to the brief or that I expect? Yeah, so I've used that toolkit, that part of the toolkit also on design projects, where there was one project where we were working with a Indigenous group. Before we met with them, we used that listening positionality exercise to get people to think about how they listened.
It's interesting because when you listen to someone without having to prompt a response, you are listening in a completely different way than when you know that the other is waiting for an answer, or you know that after the person stops, you have to give like a response.
Yeah, and I think I have a bit of a background in co-design as well, or participatory design. And I think what's interesting is when you go in with a different mindset around listening, it's much more open in terms of how the participants can feel open to communicate. You're much less likely to be very specific about how you guide the conversation. I mean, obviously it can't go on forever,
Yeah.
but it changes the atmosphere, I think, of what you're doing and how people can contribute.
Perfect. And what would you recommend us to listen, to, read, or watch in relation to feminist studies
Well,
that could help
um,
designers?
my favorite book,
Yes.
um, is by Bell Hooks, and it's called Feminism for All, or
Yeah.
Feminism for Everybody. Sorry, I love that book. I think it's super helpful, and I just think what's so important in the global context in terms of gender at the moment is there's a really strong polarization. I don't know what it's like in Finland, but there's recent research from Aotearoa, New Zealand, from the US and the UK that increasingly young women are becoming more interested in feminism, but young men are there's much more strong anti-feminist sentiment among young men, and a real kind of polarization in terms, and a radicalization actually of young men. And so for me, that book in particular, Feminism for Everybody, is really important, and it's a really nice read as well. But I think the more we can communicate and encourage everyone, or think about feminism as being good for everyone and beneficial for everyone, the better. There's a couple of other books that have come out on gender and design since my book was released. There's one called Designing for Sex and Gender Equity by Isabel Proctor, and one called Gender Designer Interdisciplinary Framework by Pinar Kaigan, who actually I reviewed that book. But yeah, I think, and that's really nice to know as well, that there's not just this toolkit on its own.
Yes. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about the future. How do you think your practice could evolve in the future, and what are the type of things that you are eager to try out in relation to these
Yeah,
topics?
it's it actually links to the last point I was making around young men, and I'm really keen to work on a more practice-based, probably coded participatory project with young men around attitudes to gender equity. I've been slightly involved with a project around consent that was thinking about using gaming to think about consent. But so I'm starting now to look at other projects that are doing that, but also think about how we might, from a design perspective, work with young men in order to help them reflect. Because I think, heteropatriarchy is, from my perspective, bad for everybody. And I think there's lots of challenges that young men face we could explore with them. So that's one of the areas that I'm hoping to work on soon, a more practical, practice-based project. I've also been exploring some other, I suppose, in some ways, kind of anti-methods around wildness, and so that kind of links to the last chapter of the book, really, and thinking about whether or maybe it's a mindset, a wild mindset that allows or helps people or challenges people in order to question some of the kind of universal methods type thinking. So I've also been working on that for a while. Yeah, I was involved in a project working with Indigenous communities as well. So that's kind of been partly an extension of that last chapter as well.
What were you doing with indigenous communities?
Would you so
It
it's a
was
project.
unclear to me.
Yeah, that one is not so much around gender. It's a project called Digitaonga, and it was working with communities to create 3D scans of Indigenous taonga, so artifacts, prized artifacts, and also working on a platform with them. So, in order to store those, so they have essentially Indigenous data sovereignty over those, but digital artifacts at least, with the idea of perhaps one day them being exchanged for the physical version. That has not happened yet.
But how does it happen that you started to work with them? Is it that was it an initiative of the community?
So it was actually this has been a very interesting project. It started as a Māori student had the idea for this project. They presented it at the school that I work, everyone thought it was a great idea. And then I was asked, because they knew that I'd done some work with communities in the past, then I was asked to work on the project. And then we had employed a expert in Mātauranga Māori, so Māori knowledge, who also then came on board, and we got a grant from the New Zealand government to work with 3 Indigenous groups. That grant's finished now, but the project is still continuing, which is really great.
But what was the goal of the New Zealand government in collaborating in this
Yeah,
project with them?
really to explore how we might think about technology, or we might, I suppose, indigenize emerging and new technologies, and thinking about, okay, well, how could we, there's, in terms of kind of thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty at that time, it was kind of thinking about, okay, well, there are some ways that we can do this with technology. And if we approach it from a Mātauranga Māori, a Te Ao Māori perspective, so the perspective of the Māori worldview, how might this technology look different? And that's what the government funding was really a kind of exploration, was funding us to explore that.
And when you are talking about indigenous sovereignty, what is
Mm.
what you are referring?
So there would be so Indigenous data sovereignty, so Indigenous people having rights over their own data and the use of that data and the storage of it. And yeah, it gets pretty complex. But for instance, lots of the data in New Zealand is not held in New Zealand. So that is a tricky situation.
And where it is this data if it is not in New
Mostly
Zealand?
mostly in the US, mostly in the US.
Okay.
Yeah. So then if you're thinking about whakapapa, so ancestry, this kind of generations of data, then having it, and the history of colonization and all that, those things, then having it stored somewhere not where you're not necessarily in control of that data is a big risk. And so that's part of one aspect that the project was kind of thinking through, or trying
And
to think through.
what is the contribution of design in this context?
Yeah, so the design, I guess it's more around technologies and thinking about how we might use existing technologies, but or emerging technologies, but design them differently. So we're actually looking at different blockchain technologies that might be useful in terms of ensuring that guardians of those artifacts are the only ones who get to make decisions about that data. So yeah, it's very technology focused, but I was employed more, or involved more on the participatory design part of the project, and the kaupapa Māori part of the project.
So I guess that some of your students in a moment, they also go to work in the public sector, right?
Yeah.
So
Yep. Some of them.
some of them. Wait, we have here a comment from Sirpa. She says that in front of a design case, how important you think it is useful to analyze what are the root causes that people are using gendered-based vocabulary. Your example
Mm.
of Siri make me think about that. When they started their use scripts from movies, and in your opinion, how Siri has changed by them, just as example.
Mm. Yeah, that's interesting. I think the language is changing all the time. So it's kind of, it's interesting. And of course, Siri now has changed because people complain. people people like me complained. Um, but I think it's a tricky one to analyze the language before you. I think, I suppose for me it will be around contextual analysis. So thinking about, okay, what design problem are we focusing on, or design context are we focusing on? And how does social inequality and or gender inequality play out in that context? And in one case, it might be through gendered language. And if you were thinking about designing a voice assistant, which is heavily focused on language, then you probably would look at language. But I think in some other cases, it might be something else. It might be like, okay, you're thinking about public spaces and designing public spaces, then that's a very different context in order to think about, okay, well, how in this public space, how does gender inequality play out in this space? And how might we design it differently so that women don't get catcalled as they walk along the street, or people don't feel afraid when it's dark? Or, I would say for me, it would always start with the space or the context in which you're designing. But yeah, of course, language is super important.
Thanks a lot, Sarah. I think we have to come to an end to this discussion. Thank you a lot for being here with us this morning for us and this evening for you.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
What really stays with me after talking with Sarah is how she helps us see design in a different way. She reminds us that design is not only about making things, it's also about noticing the world around us. Her Feminist Toolkit is not a set of strict rules, it's more like a set of prompts that help us ask better questions. What assumptions I am making? Who is this for? Who is missing? Sarah shows that if we pause and reflect on our own background, our habits, and our blind spots, we can design with a more care and intention. And maybe that's the heart of her message. Tools only work when we use them with attention. Sarah encourages designers to slow down, to think about gender in real-life context, and to understand that our choices, even small ones, shape how people feel and move in the world. I think her approach is humble, grounded, and very human. If you listen to her carefully, it can help you see that better design starts with curiosity, with listening, and with recognizing that everyone's experience is different. That's how design can support fairness and inclusion, which is exactly what feminist design is all about. As always, the music of this podcast is by Antonio Zimmerman, sound design is by Andy Fecci. This podcast is published with Creative Commons license with attributions. This was Diseño y Diáspora. You can follow us on social media channels in YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Blue Sky, or visit our website. Remember to recommend us and recommend our books. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll listen in the next episode.